pleasure to be here. And as Jed said, I was at Napier years and years ago, before you were born, most of you. And funnily enough, this Theorbo, I came here to study classical guitar, and while I was here, I transferred to playing the lute. And this Theorbo, Napier University bought while I was here. So this was actually the instrument I started on, and I hadn't seen for about 20 years. And yeah, it's a really good instrument actually, and it's languishing away in the dusty depths of the warehouse here. So yeah, I'd recommend it to anyone who wants to have a go. But now, because it's not been played for a long time, the tuning's not very secure. So I thought I'd start with, while it's in tune, do a bit of playing on it so you get to hear it, and then I'll go and do some talking once the tuning gets unbearable. Okay? Thanks. Yeah. A little excerpt from a piece there. Sorry, it's gone out of tune already. Little excerpt from a piece there from the early 17th century, a toccata arpeggiata. So let me just talk a little bit about the history of the instrument, and this will tie in with kind of all the instruments we all know, like lutes and guitars and whatever. So the Theorbo is an evolution of the lute, as you can imagine. If you can see the back of it, it's got this rounded back, and then the very ornate decorations on the soundboard. Now that design goes back thousands of years to an instrument called the oud from the Middle East, North Africa, an Arabic instrument, and that instrument comes over to Europe sometime, I don't know, early part of the last millennium. So, with either the Crusaders or through the Moorish invasion of Spain, places like that. And so that instrument gets absorbed into the sort of European culture. And obviously they like the sound, they like the look, and a lot of the features of the oud are still present. Like I say, the rounded back. Now, there